The city bus screeched to a halt on the bustling downtown street, its doors hissing open as chilly morning air rushed in. Among the boarding passengers was Evelyn Carter, a poised woman in her early 70s. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her head held high as she clutched a neatly worn leather purse. Dropping her coins into the fare box, she nodded politely at the driver before moving forward. Robert Whitman barely acknowledged her, his expression sour. "Hurry it up," he barked, his gruff voice cutting through the low murmur of passengers settling into their seats. Evelyn paused briefly, steadying herself against the rail as the bus jolted into motion. She began moving toward an empty seat at the front, her shoes tapping softly on the floor. "Not there!" Whitman's sharp tone froze her mid-step, his voice carried through the bus, drawing the attention of several passengers. Evelyn turned slowly to face him, her calm gaze unwavering. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice polite yet firm. "I said, not there," Whitman snapped, his finger pointing toward the back. "Seats up front aren't for you, back of the bus." The air seemed to thicken. A woman near the window tightened her hold on her squirming toddler, while an older man in a business suit buried himself deeper in his newspaper. A teenager glanced nervously between Evelyn and the driver, biting her lip but saying nothing. Evelyn's lips tightened as she adjusted the strap of her purse. "I've paid my fare," she said evenly. "I'll sit where I please." Whitman's jaw clenched as he slammed the brakes. The bus jerked violently, causing passengers to clutch at poles and armrests to keep their balance. Standing from his seat, Whitman jabbed his finger toward Evelyn. His broad shoulders loomed over her, his uniform taut and wrinkled from the sudden movement. "You don't make the rules here, lady," he growled. "Either you move to the back or you get off this bus. Your choice." Murmurs rippled through the passengers. Some glanced at each other with unease while others fixed their eyes on their phones or the floor, avoiding the scene. A young man near the middle row quietly pulled out his phone, the faint red glow of a recording light flickering as he angled the camera toward the unfolding confrontation. Evelyn stood her ground, her back straight and her chin slightly raised. "What you're doing is wrong," she said firmly, her voice unwavering, "and you know it." Whitman's face darkened with rage. "You think you can tell me how to run this bus?" he spat. "You're disturbing everyone else here. People are trying to get to work." He gestured broadly toward the passengers, as if expecting their agreement. Most avoided his gaze, shrinking into their seats, though a young man with earbuds dangling from his ears leaned forward. "You're the one holding us up, man," the young man said loudly, his phone still recording. "She's just trying to sit." Whitman's glare shifted to him. "Stay out of it. This doesn't concern you," he snapped. "It concerns all of us," the young man retorted, leaning back in his seat. "We're all stuck here because of you." Whitman muttered something under his breath as he stomped back to his seat, his face red with frustration. Grabbing the radio, he barked into it. "Dispatch, this is Route 23. I've got a passenger refusing to comply, requesting transit security at my location. Over." The engine hummed beneath the tense silence. Evelyn remained steady, her grip firm on the silver pole as her eyes swept across the bus. The passengers were watching now, some openly, others with subtle glances, but no one looked away entirely. Even those who had buried themselves in their phones or newspapers couldn't ignore the quiet strength radiating from the elderly woman standing at the front of the bus. The driver's words crackled faintly over the radio as he repeated his call for backup. Evelyn glanced out the window at the busy street outside where life continued uninterrupted. She turned her gaze back to Whitman, her calm resolve never wavering. "This is ridiculous," a teenage girl whispered to her friend, loud enough for those around her to hear. The woman near the toddler nodded subtly in agreement, though she kept her focus on her child. Evelyn adjusted her stance, gripping the pole with one hand while the other rested lightly on her purse. "I'm not going anywhere," she said again, her voice carrying through the bus with quiet authority. Whitman slammed the receiver onto its mount, the sound echoing through the tense silence. "We'll see about that," he muttered. But for now the bus remained motionless, its passengers trapped in the standoff that none of them could ignore. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, their unease filling the cramped confines of the bus. "She's not doing anything wrong," a woman near the back muttered, her voice barely audible yet carrying a hint of frustration. "Why is he making such a fuss?" Evelyn turned to face the passengers, her gaze steady as it swept across their hesitant expressions. "This isn't just about me," she said, her tone calm but resolute, each word slicing through the tension like a blade. It's about what's right. Spare us the speech, Whitman snapped, cutting her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. You're off this bus the second security gets here. The quiet was punctured by a child's curious whisper. Why is the driver yelling at her, Mommy? The little boy asked, tugging on his mother's sleeve. The woman hushed him quickly, her gaze darting nervously toward Whitman, as though afraid her son's innocent question might provoke him further. Evelyn's expression softened as she turned toward the boy. Sometimes, she said gently, people don't like being challenged when they know they're wrong. Don't talk to him, Whitman roared, his booming voice making the passengers flinch. His frustration was mounting, his tone growing harsher with each passing moment. The walls of the bus seemed to close in, the air growing heavier under the weight of his anger. The young man with the phone recording the scene spoke up again, his voice even but tinged with defiance. You're digging yourself into a hole, man. Everyone's going to see this. Whitman turned his glare on the young man, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. The faint sound of a siren grew louder, slicing through the tense silence like a warning bell. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, the anticipation thick in the air as the sound signaled the arrival of transit security. Evelyn remained steadfast, her hand resting lightly on the silver rail, her calm demeanor an unyielding counterpoint to the chaos Whitman seemed determined to create. The passengers fell silent again, their collective breath held as the bus door hissed open to reveal two transit officers stepping on board. Their dark uniforms stood out starkly against the bright morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Whitman was on his feet instantly, jabbing a finger in Evelyn's direction as if he couldn't rid himself of the frustration fast enough. Finally, she's been refusing to comply, he barked, his voice loud and agitated. She's holding up the bus and causing a scene. The officers' gazes shifted from Whitman to Evelyn, their expressions neutral as they surveyed the situation. One of them stepped forward, his tone measured and professional. Ma'am, we've been called because you're refusing to follow the driver's instructions. Can you tell us what's going on? Evelyn met their eyes, her voice steady and clear. I paid my fare just like everyone else, she said, her fingers tightening on the rail. He demanded I move to the back of the bus, for no reason other than his own prejudice. That's not true, Whitman interjected, his voice rising with indignation. I told her these seats are priority seats. She doesn't belong here. Priority for who? Evelyn asked sharply, her gaze locking onto him like a hawk eyeing its prey. The elderly? I certainly qualify, or are there other criteria I'm unaware of? The officers exchanged glances, their postures tense as they took in the confrontation. One of them raised a hand slightly, signaling for calm. Sir, he said, turning to Whitman, let's clarify the situation. Are these seats officially designated as priority seating? Whitman hesitated, his bluster faltering as he stumbled over his words. They're meant for specific passengers, to maintain order. Specific passengers? Evelyn repeated, her voice cutting through his excuse like a razor. What you mean is, passengers who look like me don't belong here. The bus was silent save for the hum of the engine. The passengers watched with bated breath, their discomfort gradually shifting into quiet support. A young mother whispered to her child, "She's right," and the teenage girl from earlier murmured to her friend, "This shouldn't even be happening." The officer turned to Evelyn, his expression softening. Ma'am, you're not required to move if you've paid your fare and aren't violating any policies. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, her posture remaining firm. I'm not going anywhere, she said evenly. Her words hung in the air, a quiet declaration of resolve that resonated with the passengers around her. Whitman's face reddened, his frustration bubbling to the surface. You can't just... Enough, the second officer interrupted, his tone firm but calm. Let's step outside and talk about this. As Whitman reluctantly followed the officers off the bus, the passengers erupted into murmurs of support. The young man with the phone shook his head and muttered, "About time." Evelyn remained standing, her grip on the rail unwavering, as the bus began to exhale its collective tension. The moment wasn't just about one woman refusing to move. It was a quiet revolution, a challenge to an injustice that had been allowed to persist for far too long. The officer hesitated, his uncertainty evident as the passengers watched with rapt attention. A few nodded subtly, their silent support for Evelyn growing more visible. The young man holding his phone tilted it slightly, ensuring the scene. Evelyn, Whitman, and the officers remained in clear view. Ma'am, the second officer began, his tone placating but tired. The easiest way to resolve this would be for you to move to another seat. We're just trying to handle this without further delay. Evelyn's voice remained firm, her words deliberate. I'm not the one delaying this bus. He is. If I give in now, he'll think he can keep treating people like this, and he'll be right. A ripple of murmurs ran through the passengers. The teenage girl who had whispered earlier suddenly stood, gripping the seat in front of her for balance. Her voice trembled, but her resolve was clear. She's right, she said loudly, her words cutting through the tense air. Why should she have to move? He's the one being a jerk. Whitman whipped around to face her, his face a furious red. Sit down, he barked, his voice crackling with frustration. You want to get thrown off too? That's enough, the first officer interrupted sharply, raising his hand to calm the driver. His voice carried a note of authority that silenced Whitman momentarily. Sir, we'll handle this. Is he okay? The young man with the phone leaned back in his seat, his tone defiant. Everyone's already seen what you're doing, man. This video is going viral. It'll be everywhere by tonight. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. The quiet tension that had simmered now began to boil. A man in a crisp suit near the back of the bus, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice measured but firm. She hasn't done anything wrong, let her stay where she is and let's all move on. Whitman's face darkened further, his fists clenching as if holding back a retort. You people don't get it, rules are rules, you can't just let anyone sit up here. Anyone, Evelyn repeated, her voice slicing through the noise with precision. Or just people who look like me. The bus fell silent, her words landed heavily, resonating like a stone dropped into still water. The passengers exchanged glances, a collective understanding forming in their expressions. The officers exchanged uneasy looks caught between the growing support for Evelyn and the driver's barely contained anger. Outside, the gathering crowd of pedestrians grew larger, their curious murmurs rising like a tide. A few held their phones aloft, recording the unfolding drama as if it were a public spectacle. The young man on the bus turned his camera toward the window, capturing the crowd's growing interest. We need to make a decision, the second officer said, his voice tight with the pressure of the situation. He turned back to Evelyn, his tone softening. Ma'am, are you absolutely sure you won't step off the bus to de-escalate this? Evelyn squared her shoulders, her posture unyielding. No, she said, her voice calm but resolute. I've done nothing wrong and I won't be treated like this. Not today. The officers hesitated, their authority caught in the crossfire between Evelyn's quiet defiance and Whitman's agitated blustering. The driver, muttering under his breath, stomped back to his seat, slamming his hands against the steering wheel in frustration. The air inside the bus was electric, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Passengers sat on edge, some fidgeting nervously, others staring straight ahead as if willing the tension to dissipate. Outside, the crowd thickened, their chatter mingling with the distant honks of cars stalled behind the idle bus. The first officer turned to Whitman, his voice laced with frustration. Sir, what exactly are you asking us to do here? She's not being aggressive or breaking any rules. Whitman threw up his hands. Are you serious? She's refusing to follow instructions. How am I supposed to do my job with someone like her up here, disrupting everything? You're the one making the scene, a young woman near the middle of the bus called out, her voice shaky but defiant. Not her. A smattering of agreement followed, a few passengers murmuring their support. The teenage girl stood again, her knuckles whitening as she clutched the seat back. Yeah, she shouted. She's just sitting there. What's the big deal? Whitman spun around, his glare venomous. You want me to throw you off too? Sit down and stay out of it. Let's keep this civil, the second officer interjected, his voice rising just enough to cut through the escalating tension. He turned back to Evelyn, his posture softening. Ma'am, please, are you absolutely sure you won't consider just moving to another seat? It might make things easier for everyone. Evelyn's eyes never wavered. I've done nothing wrong. If I move, it'll only make things easier for him, not for everyone else. I won't give him the satisfaction. A loud chime echoed through the bus, breaking the tense silence. The young man with the phone smirked, holding his screen up for everyone to see. Looks like it's already online, he said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. Over 1,000 views in 5 minutes. The atmosphere shifted. The passengers exchanged glances, the weight of the moment sinking in. Outside, the growing crowd edged closer, their faces illuminated by phone screens as they captured the historic stand of one resolute woman. Evelyn's calm voice cut through the tension like a knife. Troublemaker? she repeated, her tone measured but firm. For sitting in a seat I paid for? For refusing to give in to your prejudice? If that's what you call trouble, then maybe the problem isn't with me. The bus went silent again, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Whitman's face reddened further, his fury barely contained. You don't know the first thing about what it's like to keep this route running. You're making my job impossible, he snapped, his voice rising. You're making it impossible, the middle-aged woman with the leather bag retorted, her voice steady despite the tension. She's just sitting there. You're the one stopping the bus, yelling and calling the cops. We're all stuck here because of you, not her. The passengers began murmuring in agreement, their voices growing louder. Even those who had been silent earlier started to voice their frustration. Yeah, she's not the one holding us up, someone called out from the back. Just let her sit and let's go already. Whitman's knuckles turned even whiter as he gripped the wheel. You don't get it, he shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. This isn't just about her, it's about keeping order. The young man with the phone didn't miss a beat, pointing it directly at Whitman. Order? He said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Is that what you call this? Looks more like chaos to me, and you're the one causing it. Outside, the crowd had swelled, their chant growing louder. Let her sit, let her sit. It was a rhythmic demand, echoing off the buildings and drawing the attention of even more bystanders. Cars honked as drivers leaned out their windows, craning their necks to see what was happening. One of the officers stepped back onto the bus, his face set in a grim expression. He scanned the scene, taking in the passengers' frustrated faces and the driver's barely controlled rage. Finally, he addressed Whitman directly. Sir, I need you to calm down, he said firmly. This situation is escalating and it's not helping anyone. Calm down? Whitman spat, his voice trembling with anger. I'm the one trying to do my job here, and you're letting her make a mockery of it. The officer sighed, his patience clearly wearing thin. She's not breaking any laws and she's not causing a disturbance. If anything, the disturbance is coming from you. Evelyn remained seated, her posture unyielding and her gaze unwavering. She didn't speak, but her quiet defiance seemed louder than anything Whitman could say. The teenage girl who had spoken earlier stood again, her voice ringing out across the bus. You know what? Maybe you should just step off the bus, Mr. Driver. Seems like you're the only one who has a problem with her. Cheers erupted from the passengers, their collective frustration finally boiling over. Yeah, let's get a new driver, someone shouted. We don't need this nonsense. Oh. Whitman's face twisted in rage, but he seemed at a loss for words. He glanced toward the officer, who remained calm but resolute. Sir, the officer said, his tone firm, this isn't about you anymore, it's about doing what's right, and right now, you're the one preventing this bus from moving. The young man with the phone grinned, still recording. This is gold, he muttered, tilting the camera to capture Whitman's furious expression. You're gonna be a star, buddy. The middle-aged woman with the leather bag turned to Evelyn, her voice filled with admiration. You've got more guts than anyone I've ever seen, she said. Don't let him intimidate you. Evelyn gave her a faint smile, nodding in acknowledgement. Thank you, she said softly. Her eyes flicked back to Whitman. I'm not moving. Not today. Not ever again. The crowd outside erupted into cheers, their chant shifting to applause as they realized what was happening. The officer looked at Whitman one last time. It's over, he said quietly. Let it go. Whitman slumped back into his seat, his face pale with humiliation. The passengers cheered louder, their voices mixing with the applause from outside. Evelyn remained seated, her quiet strength a beacon of hope and resistance. As the officers stepped off the bus to address the cheering crowd, the young man with the phone lowered his camera and smiled at Evelyn. You're a legend, ma'am, he said. The world's gonna know your name. Evelyn gave him a small, steady smile, her gaze never leaving the road ahead. This isn't about fame, she said softly. It's about what's right. The bus finally rumbled to life, the passengers erupting into applause as it began to move. Outside, the crowd parted, their cheers following the bus as it made its way down the street. Evelyn sat tall and unyielding, her quiet defiance a testament to the power of standing up against injustice. The teenage girl adjusted her stance, her voice loud and clear. You're not getting it, are you? She said, her words cutting through the tension. We're all staying right here, because she has every right to sit where she is. The only problem on this bus is you. A few passengers nodded. their murmurs of agreement growing louder. Even the man in the suit near the back spoke again, his voice steady and commanding. "Driver, if you can't de-escalate this, maybe it's time you step aside. You're embarrassing yourself and this city." Pinkman's face turned a deeper shade of red, his fury now barely contained. "You people think you're so righteous," he snarled. "This is my bus. I'm the one in charge here." "Not anymore, The young man with the phone chimed in, his camera still rolling. "This isn't just your bus, it's public transportation, and right now the public is making it clear that you're in the wrong." The driver glared at him but didn't respond. His authority, once absolute, now seemed fragile in the face of the collective defiance surrounding him. Outside, the chants from the crowd grew louder, their voices demanding justice. "Let her sit! Let her sit!" Evelyn finally spoke, her voice steady and calm despite the chaos. "You can yell all you want, Mr. Whitman, but you can't shout down what's right. This isn't about you anymore, it never was." Her words hung in the air, powerful and undeniable. Whitman slumped slightly in his seat, his fingers still tapping angrily against the wheel. The officer who had re-entered earlier stood by the door, watching the driver closely. His voice was low but firm. "Driver, you need to stop. This isn't going your way, and if you keep escalating, the consequences will be worse than you realize." Whitman's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. The officer turned to Evelyn, his tone softer. "Ma'am, thank you for your patience. We're doing everything we can to resolve this." Evelyn gave a small nod. "Thank you, officer," she said, "but I'm not moving." The passengers seemed to take strength from her resolve. The teenage girl sat down but crossed her arms defiantly, glaring at Whitman as if daring him to try anything. The man in the suit adjusted his tie and looked directly at the driver. "Face it, you've already lost." Whitman's radio crackled with static, followed by a voice from dispatch. "Route 23, additional officers are en route. Do not take further action until their arrival. The situation is under review." The driver snatched the radio, his hand shaking with frustration. "Under review? What does that even mean? She's disrupting everything and you're just going to let her get away with it?" The officer by the door stepped forward again. "Enough," he said sharply. "No one is disrupting anything but you. If you want to keep your job, I suggest you calm down and let us handle this." Whitman looked as though he might explode, but something in the officer's tone made him pause. He sank back into his seat, muttering under his breath but no longer shouting. Outside, the crowd's chants shifted to cheers as they saw the driver's defeated posture through the window. Evelyn, ever composed, glanced out the window again. The signs in the crowd had multiplied, their messages of solidarity and justice boldly displayed. A young boy perched on his father's shoulders held a sign that read, "Be the change." The young man with the phone spoke again, his tone more serious now. "You're a hero, ma'am. Everyone out there knows it. They're standing with you." Evelyn turned to him and offered a faint smile. "I'm not looking to be a hero," she said softly. "I'm just standing up for what's right." The bus seemed quieter now, the earlier tension replaced by a growing sense of unity among the passengers. The teenage girl looked at Evelyn with admiration, her earlier fear replaced with courage. "You're amazing," she said. "I wish I was half as brave as you." Evelyn's smile widened slightly. "You stood up, didn't you? That takes courage too." The officer's voice came through the radio again, announcing that more officers had arrived to manage the crowd. Inside, however, the passengers seemed to have already decided their stance. This wasn't just Evelyn's fight anymore. It was theirs too. Whitman sat in stony silence, staring at the wheel as though it might offer him some way out, but there was no escaping the reality he had created. The crowd outside chanted louder, their cheers echoing through the air as more people gathered, capturing the moment on their phones. Evelyn glanced out at the sea of faces, feeling the weight of their support. She straightened her posture and folded her hands neatly in her lap, her quiet strength a beacon for everyone watching. This wasn't just about a seat on a bus anymore. It was about standing up, together, against something far bigger. The young man with the phone lowered it briefly and grinned. "This video's going viral for sure," he said. "The world's gonna know your name." Evelyn met his gaze, her expression resolute. "Good," she said simply. "They should know that some things are worth standing up for." The chants outside swelled into a thunderous roar, Evelyn's name carried by the voices of the growing crowd. The sound spilled into the bus, echoing off the walls and filling the space with an energy that felt electric. Evelyn sat back in her seat, smoothing the creases in her sleeve, her poise unbroken despite the storm that had unfolded. The teenage girl who had stood up earlier was practically bouncing in her seat, her hands clapping wildly. "You're amazing," she exclaimed, her grin stretching ear to ear. "I've never seen anyone stand up to someone like that." The young man with the phone nodded, still filming as he shifted closer to Evelyn. "This is going viral for sure," he said, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and respect. "People are going to see this and know your name." Evelyn turned to face him, her lips curving into a faint but genuine smile. "It's not about my name," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to quiet the bus. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." The passengers, who moments ago had been hesitant and uncertain, now looked at Evelyn with admiration. The man in the suit near the back straightened his tie and nodded approvingly. "You didn't just stand up for yourself," he said. "You stood up for all of us." The officers outside worked to manage the crowd, their voices blending with the chants and the flashing of cameras. The second officer stepped back onto the bus, his hat tipped slightly in Evelyn's direction. "Ma'am," he said, his tone respectful, "the situation is under control. Is there anything else we can do for you?" Evelyn shook her head, her composure unwavering. "You've done enough," she replied. "Now it's up to the system to do its part." The officer nodded, his expression serious. "We'll make sure everything is documented properly, and don't worry, this won't just go away." As the officers stepped off the bus again, the passengers collectively exhaled, the tension finally breaking. A middle-aged woman clutching a worn leather bag leaned forward, her voice shaky but warm. "You've inspired all of us," she said. "We'll be telling this story for years." Evelyn offered her a kind nod, her eyes scanning the bus. "Thank you," she said simply. "But this isn't just my fight, it's all of ours." The young man with the phone grinned. "Well, you definitely started something today," he said, gesturing toward the crowd outside. "Look at them, they're standing with you." Evelyn glanced out the window, her gaze sweeping over the sea of faces holding signs and chanting her name. Some held up messages like "Justice for Evelyn" and "End Racism Now," while others waved their phones, recording every moment. The sight was overwhelming, but in the best way possible. For the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt the weight of her actions ripple outward, touching people in ways she hadn't expected. The teenage girl leaned over the back of her seat, her voice earnest. "What happens now? Do you think this will actually change anything?" Evelyn turned to her, her expression thoughtful. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said. "But moments like this, they're the sparks. It's up to all of us to keep the fire going." The girl nodded, her youthful energy reinvigorated. "Well, I'm with you," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Whatever it takes." The young mother near the front, who had clutched her child tightly earlier, spoke up, her voice soft but resolute. "We all are," she said, her gaze steady. "Thank you for reminding us that it's okay to stand up, even when it's hard." The applause broke out again, softer this time, but no less powerful. It wasn't just a celebration of what had happened, it was a recognition of what it meant. Evelyn nodded, a flicker of gratitude passing over her face. "Then let's make sure we don't let this moment pass us by," she said. "Together we can make sure it counts." The bus began to hum with quiet conversation as the passengers exchanged thoughts, their earlier divisions now replaced with a sense of unity. Outside, the crowd continued to chant, their voices a testament to the power of solidarity. Evelyn sat back, allowing herself a rare moment of reflection. She hadn't set out to be a symbol or a leader. She had simply stood up for herself, for what was right. But sometimes that was enough to spark something greater. The young man with the phone grinned as he finished filming. "Ma'am," he said, "you've done something incredible today. The world's going to see it." Evelyn gave him a faint smile, her gaze steady. "Good," she said. "Maybe it'll remind people that standing up isn't just a choice, it's a responsibility." The bus jolted slightly as it prepared to move again, the officers waving the crowd back to clear the street. The passengers settled into their seats, their spirits lifted, the weight of the earlier tension replaced by something far more profound: hope. And as the bus pulled away, the chants of the crowd still echoing in the distance, Evelyn Carter knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. "Thank you for following this journey," the young man with the phone said as he finally put his device down. "Don't forget to share this story and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The world needs to see this." The bus rolled forward, the hum of its engine blending with the fading cheers of the crowd outside. Inside, the energy remained electric, a quiet triumph threading through the passengers as they reflected on what had just transpired. Evelyn Carter sat steady in her seat, her posture upright and unwavering. Though the commotion had subsided, the echoes of their collective stand against injustice lingered in the air. The teenage girl sitting across from Evelyn still clutched her backpack tightly, her face filled with awe. "Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "I've never seen anything like that. You didn't even flinch. How did you stay so calm?" Evelyn's lips curved into a faint smile. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "But sometimes, staying calm is the most powerful response. People like that driver, they thrive on intimidation. If you don't give them that satisfaction, they lose their grip." The girl nodded, her admiration deepening. "I don't think I could have done what you did." "You're stronger than you think," Evelyn replied gently. "And now you've seen what's possible when you stand up, even if you're scared. That's how change starts, with one voice." The young man with the phone leaned forward, holding up his screen. "That one voice is being heard loud and clear," he said, scrolling through the rapidly climbing views on his video. "It's already at over 100,000. People are commenting, sharing it, calling you a hero." Evelyn's expression softened as she glanced at the screen, the sheer number of views making her pause. "I'm not a hero," she said quietly. "I'm just someone who refused to stay silent. That's something anyone can do." The young mother from earlier spoke up, her toddler now asleep on her lap. "But you showed us how," she said, her voice tinged with gratitude. "I was too scared to say anything at first, but seeing you stand your ground, it gave me courage." Evelyn met her gaze and smiled warmly. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," she said. "It's acting in spite of it. Next time, you'll find your voice faster, and the time after that, you'll inspire someone else." As the bus turned a corner, the replacement driver glanced over her shoulder, her kind eyes landing briefly on Evelyn. "Mrs. Carter," she called back, her voice filled with respect. "I've been driving for years, and I've seen plenty of people deal with injustice, but what you did today, it's going to stick with me." Evelyn inclined her head. "Thank you. But it wasn't just me. It was everyone on this bus who chose to say enough." The driver nodded, her focus returning to the road, but her quiet smile spoke volumes. The man in the suit from the back of the bus cleared his throat, leaning slightly forward in his seat. "You know, I came on this bus thinking it'd just be another commute," he said, his tone contemplative. "But today, I was reminded that silence is complicity. You've given us all something to think about, Mrs. Carter." "Good," Evelyn replied simply. "Because staying silent is how people like that driver stay in power." The teenage girl piped up again, her voice stronger now. "Do you think he'll ever drive a bus again?" Evelyn's expression grew serious. "I hope not," she said. "But whether he does or doesn't, what matters is that this moment doesn't get forgotten. People need to see that standing up works." The bus pulled to another stop, the brakes hissing softly as the doors opened. A few more passengers disembarked, but not before turning to nod or wave at Evelyn in silent gratitude. Outside, the crowd had dwindled further, though a few dedicated supporters still waved their signs and cheered. Evelyn caught sight of a small child holding a hand-drawn sign that read, "Thank you, Mrs. Carter." Her heart swelled at the sight, and she raised her hand in acknowledgement once more, earning another cheer. The young man with the phone leaned closer, lowering his voice slightly. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "what do you want people to take away from this? I mean, when they see the video, what do you hope they'll do?" Evelyn took a moment to consider his question, her gaze thoughtful. "I want them to see that no matter how small you feel, your voice matters," she said. "That standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, is how we create change. And I want them to remember that no one deserves to be treated as less than." He nodded, visibly moved. "That's a message people need to hear." The teenage girl smiled brightly. "I'll never forget this," she said, "and I'll make sure my friends see it too." Evelyn's lips twitched into another faint smile. "Good," she said, "because the more people who see it, the harder it'll be for anyone to ignore." As the bus resumed its journey, the conversations quieted, but the atmosphere remained charged with a quiet hope. Evelyn looked out the window at the city passing by, the signs of life moving forward despite the chaos of the morning. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, change never was. But as she sat there, surrounded by the quiet solidarity of her fellow passengers, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: optimism. "Thank you for standing with me today," she said. her voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. This was about more than a seat on a bus. It was about dignity, about fairness, and about reminding each other what's worth fighting for. The passengers nodded, their expressions thoughtful as they reflected on her words. The young man with the phone held it up one last time. "If you're watching this," he said to the camera, "remember what Mrs. Carter said. Your voice matters, and if you don't stand up when it counts, who will?" He smiled at Evelyn and added, "Don't forget to share this story and subscribe so more people can hear it. The world needs more people like her." The bus moved steadily along the route as Evelyn gazed out the window, her thoughts racing despite her calm exterior. The events of the past day had thrust her into a whirlwind of attention, and though the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, Evelyn felt a newfound sense of strength, not just in herself, but in the voices of those who had finally spoken out alongside her. By the following morning, Evelyn Carter's name had become a rallying cry. The video captured by the young man on the bus had gone viral, racking up millions of views across social media. News outlets across the country replayed the footage, showcasing Robert Whitman's aggressive actions and subsequent arrest. Public outrage ignited like a flame to dry kindling, with protests forming outside the city's transit headquarters and hashtags like Justice for Evelyn and End Transit Racism trending worldwide. Evelyn remained composed amidst the storm of attention. She sat in her modest living room, her phone buzzing nonstop with calls, texts, and notifications. Reporters clamored for interviews while activists and community leaders flooded her inbox with offers of support. But Evelyn knew this wasn't about basking in attention, it was about taking meaningful steps to hold Whitman and the Transit Authority accountable. That afternoon, Angela Martin, a sharp and driven civil rights attorney, arrived at Evelyn's home. Angela, dressed in a sleek navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase, exuded quiet determination. She wasted no time spreading files and documents across Evelyn's coffee table. "This case goes beyond Robert Whitman," Angela said firmly, pointing to a file labeled Transit Authority Misconduct Complaints. "He has a documented history of racial profiling, verbal abuse, but the Transit Authority turned a blind eye every time. They've been complicit in enabling this behavior." Evelyn nodded, her face set in quiet determination. "Then we hold them accountable too," she said. "It's not just about him, it's about the system that protected him." Angela smiled approvingly. "Exactly. We're not just pursuing Whitman for assault, we're going after the Transit Authority for negligence and fostering a culture of discrimination." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the mug of tea she held. "Do you really think we can win?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with concern. Angela's eyes met hers unwaveringly. "With the public on our side? Yes. But it won't be easy. The Transit Authority is already in damage control mode. They'll try to shift the narrative, discredit you, claim it was a misunderstanding, anything to protect themselves." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "They can try," she said firmly, "but the truth is out there for everyone to see." Angela nodded. "That's why we'll use every piece of evidence we have, the video, witness statements, and Whitman's arrest. It all strengthens our case. But, Evelyn," she said, leaning forward, "we'll need you to testify. You'll need to tell your story in your own words." Evelyn took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "I'll do whatever it takes." In the days that followed, Evelyn and Angela worked tirelessly. Witnesses from the bus began stepping forward, offering detailed accounts of what they had seen. The teenage girl who had stood up to Whitman gave a particularly compelling testimony, recounting how Whitman had escalated the situation unprovoked. The young man who had recorded the video not only submitted his footage but also spoke about how the driver's behavior had been unjustified from the start. "I kept filming because I knew no one would believe it otherwise," he told Angela during a meeting. "What he did wasn't just wrong, it was disgusting." Even passengers who had remained silent during the altercation came forward, emboldened by Evelyn's courage. One middle-aged woman admitted to Angela during an interview, "I've seen him treat other people the same way. I didn't say anything before because I thought it wasn't my business. Now I realize how wrong I was." As the trial date loomed closer, the Transit Authority scrambled to mitigate the damage. They released a carefully worded public statement expressing regret over the incident and promising to review policies to ensure fairness and inclusivity. But the statement rang hollow. Community leaders and activists slammed it as a shallow attempt to pacify public outrage, demanding tangible action instead. Meanwhile, Whitman's legal team adopted a different strategy. painting their client as a victim of circumstances. At a press conference, Whitman's lawyer stood before the cameras, his voice measured and rehearsed. Mr. Whitman was simply enforcing the rules to maintain order on his bus, he said. This situation has been grossly exaggerated by a viral video that doesn't tell the whole story. Experts. Evelyn watched the broadcast from her living room, Angela seated beside her. Evelyn's jaw tightened as the lawyer's words echoed through the speakers. Enforcing the rules, she repeated, her tone sharp with disbelief. They really think anyone's going to fall for that? Angela smirked, her expression one of grim amusement. They're grasping at straws, she said. Desperation like this only works in our favor. It shows they're on the defensive. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her hands resting in her lap. She felt the weight of the fight ahead, but her resolve remained unshaken. The truth was out there, and now it was time to ensure it couldn't be ignored. The world was watching. Evelyn Carter wasn't about to let them down. The day of the trial had arrived, and the courthouse was alive with energy. The steps outside were a sea of protesters holding signs that read "Justice for Evelyn" and "Accountability Now." Their chants filled the crisp morning air, demanding change and echoing the courage Evelyn Carter had displayed. Reporters swarmed the entrance, cameras clicking rapidly as Evelyn stepped out of the car, Angela Martin at her side. Evelyn's head was held high, her posture radiating calm determination. The crowd erupted into cheers, calling her name as she walked up the steps. Angela placed a steady hand on Evelyn's shoulder and whispered, "You've got this." Evelyn gave a small nod, her resolve clear. Inside, the courtroom was packed, every seat occupied by curious onlookers, reporters, and supporters. Robert Whitman sat at the defendant's table, his face a mixture of defiance and unease. His lawyer leaned in close, whispering animatedly, but Whitman barely responded, his eyes darting around the room. Evelyn, on the other hand, took her seat at the plaintiff's table with quiet composure, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The judge entered and the trial began. Angela rose for her opening statement, her voice resonating with confidence and purpose. She approached the jury, her words clear and deliberate. "This case isn't just about an incident on a city bus," she began. "It's about a pattern of unchecked abuse and discrimination." Mrs. Evelyn Carter stood up that day. Not just for herself, but for every individual who has been silenced by injustice. "Today, we ask you to hold Robert Whitman and the Transit Authority accountable for their actions." Evelyn glanced at the jury, catching the flicker of their attention. The weight of Angela's words seemed to hang in the air, drawing them in. Evelyn knew this was just the beginning, but with Angela leading the charge and the truth on their side, she felt confident in the battle ahead. The first witness was called, a middle-aged woman who had been sitting near the back of the bus during the incident. She fidgeted nervously as she took the stand, but managed to answer Angela's questions with clarity. "I saw everything," the woman said. "Mrs. Carter just wanted to sit down. She wasn't bothering anyone. It was the driver who started yelling at her." Angela nodded encouragingly. "And how would you describe his tone?" The woman hesitated, glancing at Whitman, who sat rigidly at the defense table. "It was loud, aggressive," she said finally, like he wanted to make her feel small. "And did you feel his behavior was justified?" Angela asked. "Not at all," the woman replied firmly. "He was out of line. It was embarrassing to watch." Angela offered a faint, reassuring smile. "Thank you. No further questions." The defense attorney stood, his demeanor sharp and calculated. He approached the witness with a deliberate air, his tone bordering on condescension. "Ma'am, you mentioned feeling embarrassed. Isn't it possible that your embarrassment influenced your perception of my client's actions?" The woman frowned, clearly caught off guard. "Hi. I don't think so." "You don't think so?" he pressed. "But isn't it possible that you misinterpreted his tone because of your own discomfort with the situation?" Angela immediately rose. "Objection, Your Honor," leading the witness. "Sustained," the judge said, casting a warning glance at the defense attorney. "Move on." Feigning disappointment, the defense attorney stepped back. No further questions. Next, the teenage girl who had stood up for Evelyn during the altercation took the stand. Her youthful energy was tempered with a sense of nervous determination as she recounted what she had witnessed. "I saw him grab her," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "She didn't do anything to deserve that." Angela approached with a warm smile. "You spoke up during the incident, didn't you?" "Yes," the girl replied. "I told him he couldn't treat her like that." "And how did he respond?" Angela pressed gently. "People yelled at me to sit down and stay out of it," the girl said, her voice growing stronger. "But I couldn't, it wasn't right." Angela nodded, her tone filled with encouragement. "You showed great courage that day, thank you for speaking out." The defense attorney attempted to rattle her, questioning her youth and suggesting she might not have fully understood the situation, but the girl held her ground, her answers concise and unwavering. The most pivotal moment came when the young man with the phone took the stand. His presence exuded quiet confidence as he provided not only his first-hand account but also the now infamous video footage. "He grabbed her," the young man said firmly. "No one provoked him, he just lost it." Angela played the video for the court, the footage projected onto a large screen. The room was silent as it unfolded. The sharp sound of Whitman's yelling, the passengers' gasps, and the growing chants from the crowd outside. The jury watched intently, their expressions shifting from shock to quiet outrage. When the video ended, Angela turned to the young man. "This footage captures the reality of what happened that day. Is there anything you'd like to add?" He nodded. "Yeah, she didn't just stand up for herself, she stood up for all of us. What he did wasn't just wrong, it was disgusting. People need to see that." The court fell into a tense hush. Whitman's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, his attempts to poke holes in the witnesses' testimonies falling flat. The weight of the evidence and the undeniable truth captured on video was proving insurmountable. As Evelyn sat at the plaintiff's table, she felt a quiet strength wash over her. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was everyone's, and together they were making it impossible to ignore. By the time the video ended, the jury's faces reflected a heavy silence, their solemn expressions speaking volumes. Angela turned to the young man on the stand, her voice steady and calm. "Why did you record this incident?" she asked. The young man leaned forward slightly, his tone earnest. "Because I've seen stuff like this happen before," he said. "People get away with it because no one speaks up. I wanted to make sure this time was different." Angela nodded thoughtfully. "And do you feel it was different?" He glanced at Evelyn, a small smile breaking through his otherwise serious demeanor. "Yeah, Mrs. Carter made it different." The defense attorney attempted to cast doubt on the video, suggesting it might not show the full context of the situation. However, the jury's somber expressions and the undeniable weight of the footage made it clear. The video had left an indelible mark. Then it was Evelyn's turn to take the stand. The courtroom fell into a profound hush. Evelyn, poised and resolute, stepped forward. Her composure radiated strength, her voice calm yet imbued with quiet determination as she recounted the events of that day. "I paid my fare like everyone else," she said, her tone unwavering. "I just wanted to sit down, but the moment I did, he decided I didn't belong there." Angela approached her with care, her voice gentle but firm. "Why didn't you move to the back of the bus when he told you to?" Evelyn paused, letting her gaze sweep across the courtroom. "Because it wasn't about the seat," she said finally. "It was about dignity. If I had moved, I would have been saying that his actions were acceptable, and they weren't." Her words seemed to land heavily, the weight of her experience drawing every ear and eye in the room. Even Robert Whitman, who had spent much of the trial avoiding Evelyn's gaze, now appeared transfixed, unable to look away. Angela stepped closer, her next question deliberate. "What do you hope to achieve with this case?" Evelyn straightened slightly, her voice gaining strength. "Accountability, not just for Mr. Whitman but for the system that allowed him to act this way for so long. This isn't just about me, it's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." The room fell silent, her words resonating like ripples across a still pond. Angela nodded, her expression filled with respect. No further questions. When the defense attorney took his turn, his cross-examination was pointed, but Evelyn's composure remained unshaken. Each question was met with poise, her responses firm and deliberate. By the time she stepped down, it was evident her testimony had made a profound impact. The truth was undeniable, and the fight for justice was in full swing. Now, it was Whitman's turn. As he was called to the stand, the courtroom buzzed quietly with tension. The once arrogant bus driver appeared deflated, his confidence replaced by unease. Adjusting his tie nervously, he avoided eye contact with Evelyn as he settled into his seat. His lawyer began with calculated questions aimed at casting Whitman's actions in a more sympathetic light. "Mr. Whitman," the attorney began smoothly, "can you explain your perspective on the events of that day?" Whitman cleared his throat, his voice shaky but firm. I was just trying to do my job, he said. The front seats are priority seats. I told her to move because that's the rule. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I was just enforcing policy. The lawyer nodded encouragingly. And when Mrs. Carter refused to comply? I gave her chances to move, Whitman replied, growing defensive. I tried to keep things under control, but she wouldn't listen. It created a scene, and I had to act. The attorney turned to the jury, gesturing toward Whitman. Mr. Whitman was put in a difficult situation. As a bus driver, his priority is the safety and efficiency of his route. When someone disrupts that, he has to act quickly. Angela stood sharply. Objection, Your Honor, the defense is testifying. Sustained, the judge replied, casting a pointed look at the defense attorney. Counselor, stick to questioning. But the attorney nodded, his expression smooth. Would you say your actions were in any way motivated by Mrs. Carter's race? Whitman's expression hardened. Absolutely not. I treat all my passengers the same. Angela approached the stand for cross-examination, her steps deliberate and her demeanor commanding. She let the silence linger for a moment, the weight of the courtroom pressing down before she spoke. Mr. Whitman, she began, her voice measured. You say you treat all passengers the same, is that correct? Yes, Whitman replied, his tone clipped. Angela nodded, flipping through a file. Then can you explain why over the past 5 years you've received multiple complaints, 5 of which explicitly referenced discriminatory behavior? Whitman stiffened, his face paling. Those complaints were exaggerated, he muttered. Exaggerated, Angela repeated, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. So are you saying the passengers who filed these complaints were lying? Whitman hesitated, his discomfort evident. I'm saying they misunderstood the situation. Angela's gaze was sharp. Misunderstood? Or is it that you've been allowed to act without accountability for years, knowing the system would protect you? Whitman squirmed in his seat. That's not true, he muttered weakly, but the jury's attention was already fixed on Angela. She stepped closer, her voice unwavering. Mr. Whitman, isn't it true that your actions on that bus weren't about policy or safety, but about your own prejudice? Whitman's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The courtroom was silent, the weight of Angela's words pressing down on everyone present. Angela straightened, her final question ringing in the air. Isn't it true, Mr. Whitman, that you believed you could act this way without consequence because you thought no one would stand up to you? Whitman's shoulders sagged, his silence confirming what everyone in the room already knew. No further questions, Angela said, turning away. As she returned to her seat, Evelyn felt a surge of quiet vindication. The truth was undeniable, and now, for the first time, it was being heard. Angela's hand rested lightly on Evelyn's shoulder as they exited the courtroom, the verdict still echoing in their minds. The crowd outside erupted into cheers as soon as they caught sight of Evelyn, their chants growing louder and more fervent. Signs waved high above the sea of people, and reporters jostled for position, eager to capture every word and image. Evelyn stood for a moment at the top of the courthouse steps, her gaze sweeping across the gathered crowd. The young man who had recorded the bus incident was near the front, his phone raised again, but this time his expression held admiration rather than defiance. Evelyn's presence commanded attention, her poise a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding her. Angela leaned closer, speaking low enough for only Evelyn to hear. This isn't over yet. We've won this round, but there's more to fight for. Evelyn nodded, her expression steady. I know, this isn't just about Whitman. It's about the system that let him get away with this for so long. As Angela guided her down the steps, reporters swarmed them, thrusting microphones forward and shouting over one another. Evelyn, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you think this will lead to changes in transit policy? Do you have a message for others who've faced discrimination? Evelyn stopped briefly, her calm gaze settling on the crowd of reporters, her voice, though measured, carried above the noise. This case was never about just one person or one incident. It's about holding people accountable, individually and collectively. Change doesn't happen overnight, but this is a step forward, and we can't stop here. The reporters pressed in closer, eager for more, but Angela gently ushered Evelyn forward, steering her toward the waiting car at the curb. The crowd parted as they moved, their cheers following Evelyn all the way to the vehicle. The energy in the air was electric, the sense of victory palpable, but Evelyn knew that this was only the beginning. Inside the car, the noise from outside faded into the background, replaced by the hum of the engine. Angela glanced over at Evelyn as the car pulled away. "You handled that well?" Evelyn exhaled, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I've had a lot of practice staying calm under pressure. But Angela, this fight isn't just about me anymore." Angela nodded. "I know, and we're not stopping here. The transit authority still has questions to answer, and the systemic issues that enabled Whitman's behavior need to be addressed. This is bigger than a courtroom verdict." Evelyn looked out the window at the passing streets, her thoughts racing. She saw the faces of the passengers who had spoken up, the crowd that had gathered outside the bus, and the countless people who had reached out to her since the video went viral. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or overlooked. The car turned onto a quieter street, and Evelyn leaned back in her seat, her resolve hardening. "Then let's make sure they answer those questions," she said firmly. Angela smiled. "Oh, they will. We'll make sure of it." As the car drove deeper into the city, Evelyn's mind was already on the next step. There was still work to be done, and she wasn't about to back down now. The courtroom fell into a hushed stillness as the jury foreperson read the verdict. "In the matter of Carter versus Whitman and the Transit Authority," the foreperson began, their voice clear and resolute, "we find the defendant, Robert Whitman, guilty of assault and misconduct." A collective exhale swept through the room, followed by murmurs rippling through the gallery. Evelyn Carter remained still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her calm expression betrayed just a flicker of emotion, a quiet triumph, a victory hard-fought and well-earned. The foreperson continued, "We also find the Transit Authority liable for negligence in failing to address repeated complaints against Mr. Whitman." The weight of the verdict was palpable, settling over the room like a tidal wave. Angela Martin reached over, her hand lightly squeezing Evelyn's shoulder. "You did it," she whispered, her voice full of pride. Evelyn nodded, her composure intact even as her heart swelled with relief. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a precedent had been set. The judge addressed the jury, thanking them for their service, and announced that sentencing would follow in the coming weeks. The courtroom began to empty, but the significance of the moment lingered, etched into the faces of those who had witnessed it. Outside, the courthouse steps were alive with energy. The crowd of protesters and supporters erupted into cheers as news of the verdict spread. Signs reading "Justice for Evelyn" and "Accountability Now" bobbed above the sea of people. Their voices rose in unison, a chant of triumph that echoed far beyond the courthouse steps. Evelyn stepped into the sunlight, flanked by Angela and a small group of supporters. Reporters surged forward, microphones and cameras jostling for position, their questions shouted over one another. "Mrs. Carter, how do you feel about the verdict?" one reporter asked, his microphone extended toward her. Evelyn paused, her voice steady and clear as she responded. "I feel grateful. Grateful not just for myself, but for everyone who stood with me. This isn't just my victory, it's ours, and it's proof that standing up for what's right can make a difference." The crowd roared its approval, their cheers blending into the chants that continued to reverberate through the city. Angela stepped forward to address the reporters. "This case sends a powerful message," she said firmly. "No one is above accountability, and no one should have to endure discrimination. Today, justice prevailed, but the work does not end here." The crowd cheered louder as Evelyn raised her hand in a subtle wave. The moment was bittersweet, an end to one battle, but the beginning of a much larger fight. She knew the systemic changes that were desperately needed wouldn't happen overnight, but this was a start. In the weeks that followed, the Transit Authority announced sweeping reforms. Mandatory anti-bias training was implemented for all employees, and an independent oversight committee was established to handle future complaints of misconduct. Robert Whitman was sentenced to community service and required to attend anger management classes. His career as a bus driver was over. Evelyn, meanwhile, found herself at the heart of her community. She spoke at schools, community centers, and forums, sharing her story and inspiring others to stand up against injustice. Her resilience became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even small acts of defiance could create waves of change. One quiet evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Angela. "We did it. Thank you for trusting me." Evelyn smiled softly, her heart full. She typed back, "Thank you for believing in me. The fight was worth it." "Wait." As she set the phone aside, she gazed at the horizon, the fading light painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The road ahead was still long, but she knew now that the world could change, one step, one voice, one act of courage at a time. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so you don't miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I've handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you'll love. Have a great day.